Hey, this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast, where we talk with some of the most successful engineering leaders who reveal actionable management insights that help you take your developer team to the next level. This episode is brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications from design to delivery with React, Node.js, and Angular. Check them out at codingsans.com.
Hello there, everyone. I am Carolina Toth, and this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast. It is my pleasure to talk with accomplished technology leaders every other week, and today I have another really great guest, Ritendra Datta, here with me. He is Director of Engineering at Facebook currently, but before that, he was at Google for 10 years. So he has quite a lot of experience to share with us. So before we get to today's topic, I would like to ask you to tell us a bit about you and who you are and what your passions are so we can get to know you a little more.
Yep. My name is Ritendra. As you said, I am a director of engineering at Facebook, now called Meta, but I specifically work on the Facebook app. I run video recommendations for the company, specifically for Facebook and Facebook Watch. And I love my job. I love engineering. I love the way we build scalable systems, and I've done that all my career. And outside of work, I love making films. So that's my other hobby outside of work. And they're my two children, my work and my filmmaking passion. I'm passionate about both, but there's plenty of engineering and plenty of art on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Before our conversation, you said I am a director of engineering and of film, and I really love that. So I just wanted to share that with our listeners. And before we go any further, we should point out that you are not a spokesperson for either company you have ever worked for. You are here as an individual who has quite a bit of experience. So thank you for joining us today.
Of course, yeah. I mean, this is all my personal opinion from my combined experience working at these places. I mean, obviously, I'm not a spokesman for the company in any of what I say now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So today we have a very exciting topic. If we have regular listeners here, I usually speak for breaking up the silos and making sure that communication flows freely and people can collaborate. And today we will talk about managing cross-functional teams and achieving cross-functional collaboration. And with that said, let's just look into what you are doing or what you have done. How do teams function in your perspective? Yep.
So in general, I've primarily led teams of engineers and research scientists. Research scientists are essentially, they act like engineers in the companies I've worked at, except that sometimes they have a PhD that sort of makes the biggest difference between an engineer and a research scientist. Essentially, they're building products for the companies, or they're writing algorithms, they're building systems, and so on. And everyone else that surrounds us is cross-functional partner in some sense. We have slightly different nomenclature in these companies, but generally, one acronym I like to use is XFN, like XFN, cross-functional XFN partners. These include product managers, they tend to be the closest partners to us, product managers and product management directors and VPs and so on. Then there is data scientists. And again, the definition of a data scientist varies greatly in the industry, I feel. In some companies, data scientists are cross-functional partners that are actually building machine learning models and so on. In the companies I worked at, they're more focused on giving insights from data to help engineers build the right things. Then there is data engineers that actually build pipelines and things to make the data scientists and the engineers effective with data-based work. We have for product design, we have product designers or UI or UX designers. We have user experience researchers who are actually like talking to people, talking to real people to figure out, what should we build and which kind of product makes sense to build. I mean, this is all software oriented, of course. I mean, in a more general engineering sense, some of these apply, some don't, but some of these are specific to software design and software development. And then we also have product marketing managers who are sort of the liaison between the products that engineers and product managers build and the large clients that we have. So those are pretty much the big ones. There are a few other specialized areas, like for example, there are chiefs of staff that sort of bring lots of different organizations closer together by representing let's say an organization leader like a VP. They bind people together. There are of course administrative assistants who are super helpful. They like make sure that the company is running well. But the big ones are really the sort of the product managers, the data scientists, the UX designers, and the UX researchers. Those are the big ones for the kind of work I've done in my career.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so you are, as director of engineering, what does this collaboration kind of look like? How should we picture engineers working together with UX researchers or product managers?
Yeah. So the way these engineering teams are organized, usually there's a hierarchy of engineering managers and engineering leaders, all the way up to VPs and CXOs and so on. Sometimes the reporting structure affects how these teams collaborate with each other to some extent, right? In some cases, you have a sort of a product area lead that all these different XFN leaders would roll up to, and then that's a decision maker. But within these teams, specifically what happens is engineers and engineering leaders have a counterpart, typically, that is well clearly identified, right? Okay, I'm an engineering manager running a particular part of the company. I have a product manager counterpart. They may or may not have any reports. Typically, they are a much smaller set of people that really help develop the product and remove roadblocks in order to develop the right product. Product managers often partner with engineering managers as a sort of a team. Sometimes there are senior ICs who are not managers but are more like tech leads that partner. So that's a triad of leaders that are often some of the most critical set of people to make a product happen, right? So an engineering manager, a product manager, and a senior IC. So that sort of covers all the core things that need to happen. And then they partner, that triad, often through the product manager, interfaces the user experience designer, interfaces the data scientists, interfaces the UX researcher. A product manager would say, if you look at the life cycle of how a product is developed, there is probably an idea that came from somewhere, and it could come from anywhere. In a bottom-up culture, it could come from an engineer, it could come from an IC level product manager, it could come from a data scientist, it could come from anywhere. Then the product manager's job is to sort of figure out, what is the minimum viable product to build, like write a, PRD and sort of figure out how to sort of build, what's the roadmap, how much resources do we have, what are sort of considerations like privacy and security in what we build. And then they bring those ideas to the engineering team. Typically, in certain cases, all this is happening all at the same time. Like there are three of these, leads sitting together, figuring out what to build. In other cases, there's a bit of here's an idea, let's go and execute. I've seen it all. At some level, the leaders, their roles sort of blur. The lines blur between what they're expected to do. Sometimes a product manager might have a really good engineering idea, like, I want to build this thing. Sometimes an an engineering manager has a strong product sense and then they start to contribute ideas. Sometimes an IC has a very strong passion toward building a product a certain way, and then they bring it up. And in an ideal way, like, these lines are truly blurry. I actually am not a big fan of very strong boundaries between these XFN roles, but rather that it's a collaboration throughout and that people all feel included in all the key decisions that are made. One of the things I've seen people get frustrated with is when they're handed things to do. Hey, go do this. This is your roadmap. Go build this thing. People want to be included, especially those with a passion for sort of building products. They, no matter what their title is, they want to be included as part of this, including user experience designers. At both my companies, Facebook and Google, this has been a recurrent culture. We tend to hire very smart people, well-rounded folks who don't just limit their skills to one thing, unless they're in a super specialization. Typically, they're well-rounded, leaders. So they'll sort of do 80% of what they're assigned, and the remaining 20% would be sort of a little smattering of things, contributing to the other XFN roles. So, it's a scatterbrain picture of, like, a bunch of smart people getting together. They all have titles. The titles are blurry. They all love to talk to each other. They have good ideas, and they don't want to be stymied. They don't want to be restricted in what they can or cannot do. They don't want to be left out of important conversations, especially toward the early phase of a product development cycle.
Mm-hmm. And in this sense, you are painting a really exciting picture. I'm a cognitive scientist, so in my studies, I always studied a bunch of different areas of study, and so I can kind of feel the passion for looking into different aspects of a product. In these kinds of situations, how do you prioritize? Is it a decision by one single person, or is it a decision as a group of leaders? What is sort of the roadmap, the eventual roadmap? Who or how do you decide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the patterns I've seen commonly in these companies is there's quite a bit of bottom-up planning and decision making, but then that plan and the roadmap is presented to a senior leader for approval, for general support, right? So it's like the best of both worlds. I think we are probably past a period in time when a leader would just say, "Go build this," and then everyone down the sort of the food chain is just executing on that vision, and there's a precise description of what you want to build, and everyone is just doing that. I feel like people have become far more independent. They've become more well-rounded over time, I guess. I mean, I don't know if that's technically true. I'm just making a guess here, but generally people want to be more well-rounded. I think that's a fair statement. They want to not be just, execution machines. They want to be part of that initial dialogue and conversation. So generally what I've seen is like an engineering leader, a product leader, an UX researcher. And by the way, since you mentioned CogSci, I know a lot of folks in UXR who have CogSci background. So I've seen them because they're studying how humans are sort of in their research. They're sort of figuring out how people react to products and changes and so on. So these leaders, they come together. There's a document that's usually prepared, and that's sort of longer or shorter depending on if you're at Google or at Facebook or at Amazon, right? And then that is presented in some forum to a leader, and it sometimes germinates. It's not always that the first version of it gets approved. Like typically a VP or a senior director or sort of a C-suite leader looks at the plan and says, "Hey, this looks good, but let's change this, this, and this." Or sometimes they would be like, "Oh, this doesn't make sense to me because of blah blah blah." Because what we generally assume in good faith is that folks at the higher levels tend to have more wider information about markets, about timing, about budget, about the ability to execute on something that's too grand, given the, what else is happening in the company.
Right.
So then that approval is pretty important, because you do want that sponsor in the company to buy into your idea. That way, it's like 90% of it is done bottoms up, planning, road mapping, and then the remaining 10% is a dialogue between a senior leader and this team. And so then hopefully there's a sort of middle band where everyone is just happy, they execute. I think in general, companies where I've worked at are fairly sort of agile, and they do something, they try something out. It's a very sort of testing oriented culture of software design, which is you build something, you try it out, very quickly you start to get data about whether it's working or not. You go back to the drawing board, you make some changes, you go back to the leader and say, hey, here's what we learned through our initial iteration, and we are thinking of this direction. And then they'll be like, okay, let's do it. And then they'll come back and present new data and so on. I mean, eventually, hopefully, it'll get to a good state, but it's never done. The nice thing about software is that it's never done, and that's something exciting. And sometimes it's frustrating for some people who like for there to be a sharp ending to a project. But I think a lot of folks in software also like the idea of never being done.
Right, or rather maybe that something is always being improved.
Yeah, that's a positive way of saying that. Yeah.
Or optimized for sure.
Right.
So what I am gathering is that your definition of a cross-functional team really roots in maybe cross-functional people. So you mentioned like they all have titles, but maybe all the team members are really smart and they have opinions and ideas, and so with really great communication skills, they actually achieve collaboration. And so really cross-functionality comes from the people being so open-minded.
Yeah, and I think there's one more thing about this. There's a subtle point here, and the reason my experience has been like this, because I've always worked on consumer software. There are many other kinds of software and hardware and other kinds of engineering where this doesn't apply, right? So what that means is, let's say you're using Instagram Reels. You're sort of one of the engineers or one of the product managers or one of the UX researchers working on Instagram Reels or TikTok or whatever, right? You're most likely a consumer. So because you're a consumer of the product you're developing, that's why it's more natural for you to have an opinion about it, because you're using it, you're hearing your friends and family talk about it. Now, if you're in enterprise software, like you're Salesforce or something, right? AWS or you're not really likely to be a consumer of that software, and so you're much more reliant on the specialization of that XFN partner. So it's possible that it's more siloed and more clear boundaries exist in certain kinds of engineering, especially with consumer large-scale engineering products that people themselves use regardless of their function. People tend to have more of an XFN nature, because they always have an opinion. Hey, I hate this user experience. Everyone has an opinion on user experience. Recommendations, like I work on recommendations, right? Everyone is like, I hear so much about people talking about, oh, I don't like the recommendations. Well, I run that team, so obviously I take it personally, but I get that opinion from every single person. There's nobody who won't have an opinion about how good their recommendations are, right? For videos or news articles or whatever it is that we're building.
I love the recommendations on Instagram. There is like this little place where you can just discover, and it is always so vastly different that I'm like, okay, give me something. It's like a slot machine. I love it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit and see if you maybe have a story for us here about scaling these really high achieving teams and making them bigger. How do you achieve great inclusivity within these teams when they are already hopefully working so well together? How do you scale them? How do you make them bigger and better?
Yeah. I mean, one of the philosophies I have about scaling teams is that there has to be work for us to scale. I mean, you'll hear this. I don't know if you've heard this from others, but I hear this all the time. There's this notion, I mean, this is a cynical view of scaling, which is that some orgs and some leaders scale their teams for the sake of empire building, right? So I don't know if you've heard that. I love that phrase because as I've been an engineer for a long time, and I became a manager and leader only, for the second half of my career, right? So for the first half, I suffered as an engineer through sometimes noticing people scale for not for the right reasons. One way in which I think scaling makes sense is when the product itself is scaling and you have more problems to genuinely solve. And the number of engineers, number of product managers, number of managers, engineering managers, all of those cross-functional teams are too small for the number of requests coming in. Because as usage goes up, as the product scales, if it finds market fit, there will be more demand to do more things. Because typically, like large companies, they throw die and they try out 5 different things. 2 of them succeed, 3 don't. Then they want to double down. They want to move resources to the 2 that worked. I mean, that's kind of the way in which you're sort of exploiting success, right? Okay, this worked. So when that happens, you need to scale up the teams, all of these teams, not just the engineering teams, but I've been mostly experienced with scaling up engineering and research scientist type roles. I took, for example, at Facebook, when I joined, it was about 30 people. In the course of like 2 years, it became 120. We started with 2 managers. We ended with 13 managers and so on. So it's a hierarchy, as you can imagine. But somehow we've managed to scale up to the extent where even after we scaled up, no one really felt that it was an unnecessary growth. So we've grown when it had made sense, and that's kind of the first principle of growing. You grow when you really need to grow, and you have all the right indications that a larger team is necessary for a better product that has already found market fit.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I actually I haven't had this conversation, and I talk with engineers all day. But what you are saying, which I think is a great point, is that even when you know that scaling is coming, you should look behind the scenes and see, is this really necessary? And in most of my conversations, we just take it as a given and say, okay, talking about scaling, what should we do and how should we do it? So thank you for that point.
Yeah. I think the philosophy that this is driven by is this. It's better to have a smaller team that is required to aggressively prioritize than to have a larger team that is doing redundant work, where there is infighting going on because multiple teams are operating on the same thing. I always prefer to have a leaner team that is making hard calls about what not to do than having multiple teams doing the same thing, because that latter is really bad for engineering culture. It really is a morale hit because people don't know, okay, so today I'm seeing it because I'm on the ground. As an engineer, I'm seeing from the point of view of an engineer, engineers typically see this very clearly. Hey, they're actually working on the same piece of code or whatever, and they're building the same product, and they're like, hey, is this necessary? They see it before some of the leaders do sometimes. So then they're like thinking, eventually my bosses are going to see this and they're going to like combine these teams and my job will be at risk or whatever. So that fear of being made redundant is real. And every large company, I'm not talking about small startups that we know are operating very lean because they just can't afford to. For very large companies, it's difficult to track how big or small is big enough because those who make decisions about scaling up teams often act with incomplete information. They're sort of making guesses. Okay, we should maybe we should just double this because there's some math that makes sense. Double the team means double the productivity. Some simple things are used to sort of decide that because there's no other good way. And then deal with the after effects of some of these bad scaling decisions later on, which is not great. Which is why, so what I said here comes out of experience.
Right. So and you said that when you do need scaling, then you need to make sure that everybody has more than enough work, or that's how I took it.
I think so. It's not always the case, but I feel like that's the right way to do it. Sometimes, in some cases, it might make sense to, like, I think the idea is like you scale up, and it's like a room, right? You scale up and there's always enough work. I've heard this a lot, right? There's always enough work to fill the room. Like, it's like air. You eject air to a larger and larger room, it'll always fill up more air. So there's a philosophy that is a little different where you say like, yeah, this is a successful product. Let's build a much larger team. I'm sure we'll find work. It sometimes it sometimes works and sometimes it doesn't work. So that's why my personal choice is to like, be smaller and grow carefully, but that's not necessarily the right. There's no right answer here. You know, in a different world, if you could run parallel worlds experiment, my philosophy could fail in some cases and might succeed in other cases. But it's just what I choose to believe.
Right, and we are here to talk about your experience.
Yep.
So, so if the scaling is warranted, have you made different like stages as to what a good amount of team growth should be in your opinion, or how do you manage the large amounts of work and growing the team simultaneously?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is no magic bullet here. It's always very complex and sort of every time it has been different, right? So it's almost never that I've never been part of a team that has not been in some critical path of something that has to be built, regardless of who else we are hiring, how we are scaling and so on. So yes, we are sort of always in this thing where we are sort of in the boat is moving and we are growing the boat while it's moving, in a way that people are not falling off the boardwalk or whatever and into the. So we are keeping everyone protected. We are moving fast, and the boat is growing in size and capacity, right? So it is kind of a very bad analogy, I think, but it's kind of what I just thought of in the moment. Scaling needs the right leaders, and I think that's where. Sometimes it's a great idea to hire really good leaders before you know how they will grow. And I know that a lot of companies do this, right? So they'll hire some of the top leaders in the industry who have an experience scaling, and then they will give them a charter of growing. So I've done this before. I've hired managers who I know have a history of scaling up, like hiring new people, training them up and building out a solid charter. I've also seen the other case, and I feel like that the other one is a little bit harder, where you hire a bunch of people, you have a bunch of direct reports, and then you bring in leaders and managers and create. I think both work, but the first one brings that leader along in the scaling process, because as you scale, they scale. So they are also learning to scale, and you're also building a bench in the process, right? Because as the orgs grow, it's important to have benches, because now you have bigger and bigger. You're the captain of a larger ship. What if you fall sick, or if you have to go somewhere? Who's gonna take over, right? So with a smaller ship, you can just it can run in autopilot for a while. A larger organization cannot run in autopilot. They sort of start to collapse more with key leaders not being available. So scaling up, building the leaders, and if possible, bringing the leaders early rather than late. This is a very tricky. I do want to say something. This is a very tricky one, right? So one of the challenges with this is when we hire managers, for example, right? A lot of times the key question that the manager asks is, how many people am I going to manage? Because it's a bit of I'm guilty of the same, right? We all want to run bigger teams in some sense, right? No, I'm not saying all. I'm saying most, but I'm just using the euphemism of all.
And then you tell them, I don't know yet.
Exactly. But that's like, and then some of the people will not be happy with that answer and will join a different team, right? In other cases, so basically I've found both kinds of leaders. Some leaders, they're happy to take on a charter and grow it from scratch. Other leaders want to be given a big charter from day one. I've seen both. I think I would say the second one is more common, where they want to run a larger team from day one. And I wouldn't say I'm any different. I've had that in my experience, and I've gone back and forth of whether that is a good idea or not. But if possible, scaling is more effective if it's the former. But those leaders are harder to find. These are people that really want to experience scaling up. Like, hey, give me 10 headcount, give me 2 engineers. With those 2 engineers, I'm going to keep the current project that you mentioned, right? There's a current project that's critical. They keep that running. They keep those people protected from the scaling process. They go and hire 5 other people. They build a charter around those 7 people now. And then they hopefully, this is kind of the ideal thing where they scaled up, the team scaled up. None of the existing projects were slowed down because of that scaling process. And you repeat this over and over again. Like in a hierarchy, you can imagine a manager of managers doing the same thing, right? A manager has one manager. They're sort of building some product. Now they're given a new charter and they have nothing. They just have a bunch of headcount. So they first have to hire a manager. Then they have to hire a bunch of ICs. If they're lucky, it'll happen. The manager hiring will happen first. If they're not so lucky, they'll hire a bunch of engineers who will directly report to them. Then they will hire a manager to layer them over. And that's a better way to scale. One thing about scaling that I found different between Google and Facebook is at Facebook, managers are expected to do a lot in terms of taking care of engineers. So the manager role is more involved as I have experienced it. Of course, these are very large companies. Different parts of these companies almost operate like different companies. But like if you have like at Google, I remember at some points of time, we had a manager with 30 reports. I've never seen that at Facebook or Meta because, it just doesn't happen because there's so much work to be done per engineer. So therefore, like it tends to be managers at Facebook tend to have fewer direct reports than managers at Google. That's my pure anecdotal experience. Things could have changed in the 3 years that I've not been at Google, but yeah.
Right. What do you, and I don't know if this is within scaling, but it really speaks to me what you just said about bringing the managers along while you're scaling. But my first instinct is to have my existing team and kind of decide, okay, who is going to be a manager now? If there are people in my existing team who really want to try themselves out and they have the skills that are necessary, then do you think it's a good idea to have, for example, you have a bunch of ICs and 5 of them, are happy and able to take the next big leap in their career and become engineering managers? Would you allow that, or would you rather bring in experienced people who have done scaling before? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And the honest answer is that I've done both and I've seen both with roughly equal probability. Now, when you're making one of your engineers become a manager they become their manager of their peers. Now, that sometimes lands, sometimes it feels like they lost an opportunity to build out. Like in the companies I've worked at, moving from an IC role to a manager role is not a promotion. I know that in some companies, some industries, I guess, being a manager is I grew up in India where I think being a manager was a thing, right? You really wanted to be being a manager. Like people would ask like, hey, you've been in the industry 20 years. Why are you not a manager? That's not a question we ask in our industry here. Like people are like, if you can maintain being an IC for the longest time, that's great. But it's a lateral move for the US based tech industry in general, right? There could be exceptions. So in that sense, it shouldn't be something that affects your peer group because they became their manager, because it's not a promotion. But some people still, have that belief. So that, they lost on an opportunity to be a manager. There are many reasons for that. But yeah, I mean, I think like it almost feels like for different situations, different solutions are better. I'll give you an example. When I want to build a team that is very technical, and there is an engineer who's pretty senior and has shown enough empathy toward their peer groups. Like the biggest thing about an engineer becoming a manager is how much empathy do they have? Do they like the idea of not getting credit for work they do directly, but rather, giving credit to their team and being okay with that? These are some of the engineers who become managers tend to be superstar engineers. So they're used to getting a lot of accolades and saying, hey, pats on the back, hey, you did an amazing job. Like now you become a manager, suddenly, are you able to like handle that transition? If we have such a person on the team and there's a need for a very technical manager, then it's a great idea to sort of grow a manager from within the team. Now, if it so happens that there's no one like that, and it's a matter of scaling to a large extent, like you're starting with a 15-person team, it's very hard for someone who's becoming a manager for the first time to start off with a 15-person team. So that's the difference that I see. Like, you really need to start off at scale. See if you can hire someone who has done it before. If you're a 4-person, 5-person pod, and you just need a manager to like really be like almost like a semi-tech lead and semi-manager kind of a role. We have these designations in these companies called TLM, tech lead managers. So it's great to like have someone within the team, take on that charter.
Thank you. I think that is clearing up some fog. Let's circle back a little bit into the cross functionality that we have talked about. You mentioned data science and UX research and software engineers. Have you had any experience when these really smart people were sort of a little siloed, and so you had to kind of make sure that each team understands the value of the other team, like either existing teams or hiring new people for doing data science or for doing UX research, and making sure that the existing software engineers were respectful or understanding what the value was of the cross functions.
Yeah, 100%. And I have seen all of this. I've seen lack of respect for the other function for every pair of these. So I've found engineers to say like, what do these product managers do? Product managers to be like, what do these engineering managers do? Engineering managers like, what is that IC doing? ICs are like, what is the point of this UX research when we are just going to end up building what the product manager says we'll build? So, and then of course, like there are also the privacy. Sometimes we have these privacy XFN partners who are just focused on like making sure that product is complying with company level privacy guidances. I mean, these are newish roles that have come to existence in companies like these that are under scrutiny for privacy related matters. So yes, it's pervasive. It can be frustrating, especially if you're on the other side and you hear people say that, and I think maybe your follow-up question is what have you done, right? So
right.
Yeah. So I think one of the most common questions, here are a couple. This is not even XFN, but it's like literally in the reporting chain. Sometimes an IC may not see what their skip level manager does. It's very common for them to say, hey, I can see what my manager is talking to me. What is my skip level manager doing? They have like 3 reports, 3 managers under them. What are they even, what is keeping them busy? That's common. Now, this is also very common for engineers to not see the value of product managers, of data scientists, because I think the bias is engineers believe that they're building something, and everyone that's not immediately building something can sometimes be seen as not as valuable, right? So this is a problem, right? It is unfortunately a bias in our in these organizations that requires more. This is actually a problem of inclusion in some sense, right? You don't see somebody else's contribution, and therefore you feel they're not necessary. But one thing I've noticed is that it's because they don't see the value they bring. It's a lack of information rather than passing judgment on all information available. So most of the times this happens because of the lack of respect, the lack of value comes from lack of knowledge rather than knowing everything and yet doing this. So if we spent a day, here's I'm going to jump to a solution that I've seen work, right? Sometimes we would have these empathy sessions, XFN empathy sessions, right? Like you'll spend like 4 hours, block 4 hours in a day, have people representing all these cross functions, like maybe the key tech lead, IC, a manager, a product manager, a data scientist, a UX researcher, get together somewhere maybe outside of, work, somewhere, have like an offsite kind of a thing and spend the day talking to each other. What is frustrating about what you do? What do you think I do? Like explaining what you do, explaining what's frustrating about what you do, and explaining why it's tough. Like I've noticed that every time we have these XFN empathy sessions, everyone goes home feeling a little bit humbled by what the other people are doing and the struggles that other people have. Because a lot of times people are not thinking negatively unless they are experiencing some negative thing, right? For example, they're burnt out with too much work and they see like, hey, we are working so hard. What are these people doing? Well,
why aren't they working so hard? Yeah,
exactly. But you go to these XFN empathy sessions and you realize everyone is working hard. Everyone is overworked. Everyone is struggling for different reasons. And so suddenly like it's often what I hear, the most common thing I hear is it was an eye-opening experience seeing what the UXR is struggling with, their challenges, the value they're bringing. I didn't realize, for example, I'll give an example of a UXR, right? So these companies that I've worked at are very data driven, right? Everything is, run A/B tests and, blindly, almost like blindly pick the ones. That's the standard way of doing things. Okay. Oh, right. People like this more. But UXR sometimes the data is just not capturing the emotions that we want out of people using our product, right? That's where UXRs come in and you see side A and side B, you see the data on side B is really good. But UXR suggests that side A is unanimously preferred, right? So like you bring 10 people to the room and they tell you, folks, this is a terrible experience, but I'm going to use it more. And that's the metric you're measuring. You're using it not for the right reasons. So the metric looks good, but the metric is not capturing the emotion you're trying to capture. So suddenly the engineers are like, oh, if we just blindly rely on data, we would have made the wrong decision and people would have been frustrated. Wow. It happens all the time in tech because sometimes there's a bit of arrogance over being technically precise because that's how. So the pipeline of hiring people is also through that channel, right? So we are biased toward very technical, very mathematical people.
People who are like us.
Yeah, exactly. And that just reduces inclusion and creates more of that siloed behavior. And I think engineers tend to be a little bit more guilty than other functions in feeling that way because they have certain pride of building things. But, we should just, I feel like we should do an exercise in some company somewhere, I don't know where you just remove a lot of these functions for 6 months and see what happens. And
I wonder which company would be okay with doing that. Back to the empathy session, I really like this idea. Can you tell us a bit more about this? Is that something that you drive as director of engineering, or is it something that is driven by the different functions, or is that something that people do on a regular basis and it's just a given that if you are on this team, you are going to do, an empathy session every other quarter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I believe, at least speaking for myself, and these things, I personally feel I've grown into being a servant leader, not like someone I'm not very comfortable giving top-down instructions to people. I generally feel like there are people in the room who are smarter than me, who know better than me, and the XFN group is collectively a better brain trust than me individually trying to dictate, when to have empathy sessions or even to drive it. So generally what I've generally encouraged people to do it. Generally, like the best way in which these get organized is some XFN, some engineer or engineering manager within my org, teams up with their product manager counterpart and says, hey, let's do this. And they just check with me. I mean, I barely do the job of like saying, hey, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense. But they do they're much better at really organizing it. My job is to encourage those sessions and remind people to have those sessions more often, especially when I see like that no one is ill-intended, right? That's the main thing, right? Empathy sessions don't make sense if I sense malintent or lack of good intention, right? So when I see that it's just miscommunication or lack of empathy because you just don't know what the other people are struggling with or adding value to, that's when like, one example is doing this like twice a year, like once every half might be a good idea. Just like that, even if you don't sense this problem, it's almost like you're 10 steps ahead of a problem that might arise. So almost like having a small XFN group meeting every 6 months might not be a bad idea. I'm being very prescriptive here, but I think it's just something you almost have to like pick because, today you don't have that problem. What if you have it tomorrow? Like, how do you make sure people are aware of what each one is doing and what challenges they're facing? And so,
right. Yeah. You mentioned that if you sense malintent, then you don't encourage this empathy session. What do you do then?
I think that becomes more of a performance conversation with them and their leaders to make sure that they, like the biggest one. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm going to be brutally honest. There was an article like 2 days back of large companies driven by promotion culture, right? That to me is the number one malintent. It's not really malintent, rather it's selfish intent, right? Like if some leaders are solely focused on their personal career growth, it doesn't always lead to the right decisions from their perspective. And that's the extent of malintent that I've seen. I haven't seen other extreme cases of malintent, but they're also like, I think like, for example, if this XFN partner is saying, hey, I want to do this, what they're not saying is I want to do this because it will help my career and not because it's right for the company or the product or the users. That I consider is, then when you go into this empathy session, it doesn't really help because their mind is still on that thing. Okay, what am I getting out of this? What am I getting out of this?
So
it's not about empathy. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So just so that I understand, I was going to say, they probably have all the information, but the reason for them to, for example, question what are those project managers doing or product owners or whoever, is that they want to advance their own career rather than making sure that the product development is going as smoothly as possible, right, or the feature development or whatever.
And this happens more within a function, but among peers, because you're less likely to be competing with an XFN partner for a promotion. But like if you have a peer manager in a close by org and you're both fighting for scope on some things, you can sometimes see this behavior. And so then I'm generalizing XFN to not just like a PM and an engineer, but also a manager here and an engineering manager here and an engineering manager there. They're down the line, they want to like get more scope. Sometimes, with the right intention, they have enough separation of scope and responsibility that they're not competing with each other for the wrong reasons. But they're frustrated with each other because they don't think they're all adding enough value. In that case, it's actually a good thing to just sit down together. Hey, look, I have 5 engineers. I've been asked to do 10 engineers worth of work. What do you want me to do? Right? So that's the kind of situation where I do think empathy sessions can help. But if they're just fighting for more scope, empathy sessions don't really help because then they're just like, people will come with the same belief that they'll go with the same belief that they came with.
Thank you. Awesome. So I'm circling back a little bit. You mentioned that largely you encourage empathy sessions in this part of the conversation, rather than prescribing them to the people who you are working with. As director of engineering, though, what do you do to encourage or enhance the performance of cross-functional collaboration? What are some of the tips you can give to our listeners to encourage this kind of mindset?
Yeah. I think one of the things that, of course, like these empathy sessions are sort of infrequent and it's not going to be like a staple. But the biggest one in my mind is inclusion. Having the right leaders in everyday meetings to make sure they feel empowered and included and heard in key decision-making forums is really important, because people do feel left out when they are not invited to the right forums. And it has multiple problems, right? First problem, those who are not included become aware of those forums and meetings and so on and start to feel excluded. They're like, okay, someone will reach out to me for this one specific thing, but it's like very late in the game. So even though I don't particularly like this part, I'm just going to have to just do it, right? So that's number one. That doesn't help here. It doesn't foster that culture of like a collaborative XFN group. So number two, that function might play an important role in what's going to happen down the line, but they're not being heard because they're not in the room. So they're not represented. So it's bad for not just for them, but also for the company. Because, as early as you can bring them in, the better, because they sometimes bring perspectives that a bunch of engineers, like it's the problem of inclusion in everything, right? If you have a bunch of only men designing some product that both men and women are going to use, are you really going to have an inclusive product? It's not clear. So I think this, for the same reason, XFN representation is essential from the very beginning, so that the product design from the early funnel to the final product is mindful of all the functions. So that's one thing. So the inclusion is, in my mind, the biggest part, because I think people have opinions. People want to be part of that early conversation. The second thing is, resourcing, right? Like, it's sometimes people don't understand how much work a particular XFN needs to do to make something real, because again, same thing, they were not part of it. And late stage, now they're overworked. No one likes to be overworked when they could have easily fixed that by planning early on. Okay, we needed two UXRs, UX researchers. We needed 3 data scientists, but now we have 1 of each. And if only we were part of this conversation at the beginning, we would have been there. So that was my number one tip, which is to like be inclusive of XFN in key decision-making points. Be respectful of all the opinions, because they are probably seeing something that you're not seeing. And this is where like you don't let ego come in the way of doing the right thing when it comes to a team.
I love that. Thank you. We can just, call it today. I completely agree with you. And you are getting to my last question. I am considerate of time here. Not really, because we're out of time. But I really think that this has been a really great conversation, and people who are going to watch this conversation will go away or go home or go back to work with some new ideas as to how to foster this collaboration. But I'm sure there are some pitfalls that you have seen. And being, for example, including too many people in a meeting, everyone knows this, like people are included and everyone is at the meeting, and so we don't get anywhere. What are some of the things that people who are looking into being more inclusive in their cross-functional collaboration should be aware of, so they don't make the mistakes that perhaps you have seen? Yeah,
that's again, amazing question. And I've seen this as well. too many people in a meeting, too many decision makers, they're all bad ideas, right? Too many people in a meeting, unless it's a one-sided conversation where someone is disseminating information, there is really a cap of like, I don't know, less than 10 max for any meeting. I don't see that. I see much larger meetings. One principle that I've followed in the past is like, do you have the right for each function? Do you have the right decision maker in the meeting, or the right person? If yes, you don't need anyone above in the reporting chain. You probably don't need anyone below the reporting chain just to make them feel good, right? Sometimes, at least when I was an engineer early on, I had so few meetings that I used to love being part of meetings. And now I just try to reduce as many meetings. I want to be part of as few meetings as possible. So it's a dramatic change going from too few meetings to too many. And sometimes meetings bloat because people think that not being part of that meeting means you're also out of the conversation. That's not always the case. If you have the right communication channel, you have the right leader present and they figure out the right piece of information that you should know and give it to you, like maybe your manager or maybe your tech lead IC. If you as an individual is represented well and at the right level of granularity, you don't need to be part of that meeting. So having key representation from each function allows us to, because there are only like less than 10 XFNs, functional pillars anyways, right? So by definition, you're limiting the team meetings to less than 10, maybe less than 5 even. So again, to summarize, having the right decision makers at the lowest level, like whoever can make the right decision at the lowest level being present is good enough. You don't need the entire reporting chain present. That reduces unnecessary bloat in the meeting. Having every XFN represented so it's inclusive, and making sure that there's a clear flow of communication from those who were present at these decision-making forums and those who were not, allows for everyone to feel like they know everything. There's nothing they missed out. And finally, as I've experienced in my entire career, it's great. The grass is always greener on the other side. At some point in time, I love to be part of every meeting. Over time, I've found that my time on this earth is limited. I don't want to spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour on a meeting that I regret being part of because I was neither here nor there. I wasn't even able to build anything during that time. I wasn't being able to fully concentrate because I wasn't an active participant. Because I was not.
You're not an addition.
Yeah. So then valuing your own time allows you to not insist on being part of every meeting. And that also helps keep these decision-making forums and meetings lean and effective.
Thank you. And it sounds like trusting the communication channels and trusting your teammates is also a very big one, so that people don't want to be in all the meetings because they know I'm going to hear about this if I need to hear about this.
Exactly. So that's where the assuming good intent is important. Like if hopefully we are part of organization where everyone has good intent and no one is hiding. I have heard of cultures where, someone hides information because it's to their advantage, but it happens more often than we want to believe. But hopefully you're not part of a company where that's a bigger problem to solve than just being part of meetings. But
Right. Thank you. I think we could go on forever, honestly. I really have been enjoying this conversation. We have touched on a bunch of different things when it comes to managing cross-functional teams. My biggest takeaway is the empathy session, hands down. I love that. I'm going to encourage it, facilitate it, whatever it might take. Of course, if people want to be part of a conversation like that, and they should want to be part of a conversation like that.
Beer or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Pizza and beer.
Yeah.
So we have covered a lot of the ground. Is there anything else that you would like to add so that our listeners hear about it or know about it, or something that is important for you to share in this context?
Yeah, it is. Like, I think the one takeaway, as I was talking through this, I think the one takeaway is to not try your best to learn more about what others do around you. I mean, the biggest problem I feel when people have conflicts within orgs across XFN is when there is not a transparent flow of information and understanding, and again, I'm going to use the word empathy among the right people. So, there are more number of cases where a conflict happens because of misunderstanding and lack of information flow than of malintent. So I've always found that to be true. I've always started I've been oh, I really dislike this person. I really dislike what they're doing. And then I spend some time with them and my mind, it's so common for me to be wrong about somebody else that I'm not very close to. So getting close to people, understanding what they do will really help you become a better leader over time, because that's the difference between people who just harbor hard feelings versus those who overcome that and bridge the barriers.
Right. And I think that speaks to your character when you say you are someone who overcomes their own kind of decisions about situations or people, because that's like one of the hardest things, I think a lot of leaders are quick to judge just because it has helped them in the past, but some of the best leaders are also quick to let go of their judgments if the data indicates differently.
Yeah, and I'm quick to judge all the time, but I'm just self-aware that I'm quick to judge. So then I correct myself. There's no way, there's this unconscious bias we all have. But the important thing is to be able to be aware of it and sort of correct for it. I cannot claim that I'm not quick to judge at times, right? But then I know, hey, asking myself that question helps.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. Ritendra Datta was my guest today. And before we go, I would like to ask you, where can our listeners follow your work?
I write sometimes on LinkedIn. I have 32 followers on Twitter, so no point going there.
Nice.
But LinkedIn is
or maybe
better.
After this.
Maybe after this. But you can just search for my full name on LinkedIn. You should be able to see some of I've written some long posts there about, engineering leadership and, generally being human. So yeah, you can find some of my stuff. Then I'll keep writing from time to time on LinkedIn, because I find I have the right audience there for what I have to say. Right.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I hope we can have another conversation sometime, because this was really fun. Dear listeners and watchers, I am Karolina Tóth. Today, my guest was Ritendra Datta, and we talked about managing cross-functional teams to collaboration. And I think this gave us a lot to think about and to try out for our teams. So thank you very much for joining Level Up Engineering.
Thank you, Karolina. I really enjoyed my conversation. You asked some really amazing questions and it made me think on the spot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. And everyone else, I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for staying with Level Up Engineering. If you enjoyed this podcast, so will your friends. Share this episode on your favorite social networking platform. To stay up to date with our content, follow Level Up Engineering on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Podcast. Brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications with Angular and Node.js. Check them out at codingsans.com.